Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. Welcome to today's webinar on Canadiens' perception and actions related to wildfire and risk resilience. If you haven't met me before, I'm Carrie Martins, the Fire Chief of Banff and the CAFC Vice President. I also chair the Climate and EDI committees, and I have the pleasure of sitting on the National Advisory Committee for FireSmart Canada. We have a terrific audience, and I know you'll find the next hour time well spent. As part of my welcome, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the National Office of the CAFC is on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people. We acknowledge them as the keepers of the Ottawa Rivershed and its tributaries. We recognize the hurts and harms of the past, as well as the strength and resilience of the people, and believe working together can make a better future. You're also invited to share your own land acknowledgement in the chat if you would like to do so. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank all of our audience members for coming today. It's not quite as fun as being in a room together, but we see you there and we appreciate each of you and what you do, particularly as the start of wildfire season is right around the corner. We all know that wildfires are complex, adaptive systems, and everyone has a role to play, including the public. Here to talk to us about how the public assesses wildfire risk and behavior is Dr. Kaitlyn Fallow. CAFC had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Fallow when we were asked to partake on a committee Kaitlyn and her team were working with through Impact Canada and the Privy Council office. When we heard about her study, we thought we'd better get Dr. Fallow in front of our membership. So here she is. Dr. Fallow is a behavioral science fellow at the Impact and Innovation Unit, Privy Council Office, Government of Canada. Dr. Fallow will present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A. So please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And please welcome Kaitlyn.
Thanks very much, Carrie. Just share my screen here. So the Government of Canada released its first national adaptation strategy just a little over 2 years ago now, really reflecting this growing recognition that making Canadian communities more resilient to extreme weather and other impacts of climate change is going to require a proactive whole-of-society approach, including in some cases changes to individual behavior. So that's kind of where I've come into this as a behavioral science fellow. One of the Impact and Innovation Unit, or Impact Canada, one of their research programs has been this Program of Applied Research on Climate Action, or PARCA. And this is a partnership with two other government departments, Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the program has included a number of different projects, really applying a behavioral and social science lens to various kinds of climate mitigation and adaptation issues. So through PARCA, I've been working with Natural Resources Canada's Canadian Forest Service here in Victoria at the Pacific Forestry Centre. So we launched the project that I'll be talking about today to try to better understand Canadians' behaviors and perceptions related to wildfire and risk reduction. And the work that I'll present is a survey that was developed with input from a few teams within government, as well as representation from two external organizations. So CAFC being one of them, and the other being FireSmart Canada. And so that committee provided a lot of really useful feedback and guidance as this project developed. So just to review the main research questions that I'll cover in this presentation, although there were a number of others that we're still looking at or hoping to look at going forward. One was just what are the current levels of various kinds of wildfire risk reduction measure adoption in Canada? What are some of the barriers to more widespread adoption of these things? And for people who are already doing them or who have plans to do them, what are their primary motivations? We wanted to look at whether we can increase interest in some of these measures using a simple behaviorally informed messaging intervention. And then finally, we wanted to look at whether people who perceive wildfire risk in their area as higher are more likely to take risk reduction action, as you would hope to see. So just to give an overview of the topics that were in this survey, I'll really only cover a small portion of the results today, but we had a number of demographic questions, questions about perceived wildfire risk and past experience with wildfire, and a number of questions getting at different kinds of social and landscape and community factors that are thought to potentially be involved in the likelihood of taking risk reduction action. Then we had a series of questions about the risk reduction measures of interest, and I'll get into those in a little bit more detail on the next slide. And that was followed by the experimental manipulation, which I'll talk about in more detail towards the end when I cover a couple of those results. And then following the experiment, we just had a few different kinds of outcome variables, focusing primarily on the impacts of the experiment on intentions to adopt the various kinds of risk reduction measures going forward. I also just wanted to give a bit of an overview of the behaviors we asked about related to reducing or mitigating wildfire risk. So I won't read all of these out, but we got baseline measures of all of the measures listed here to get a sense of how many people are already doing these things. And then we asked about intentions to do these things going forward after the experiment. So just starting at the top here, there were 5 of these kind of miscellaneous behaviors related to community engagement around wildfire risk and taking steps to really understand local and property level risk. And those included things like just talking to your neighbors about wildfire risk, having risk assessments done on your property, or attending a local event about wildfire. Moving down, then there were 3 sets of these residential FireSmart recommendations. So there were 6 of the home features, these kind of bigger structural modification type things like having a fire-rated roof. Then there were 4 measures involving modifying the yard or managing vegetation on the property, some of these kind of larger scale projects like pruning or really thinning trees. And then there were 4 of these maintenance measures, these kind of lower effort things that should be done on an ongoing basis throughout the highest risk part of the year, like clearing debris from the yard and surfaces of the home. There were also 9 behaviors related to protection from wildfire smoke, and I won't get into those in this presentation, but happy to discuss those more after if there's specific interest in those as well. So the survey was conducted in February and March of last year, and we ended up with a sample of around 3,200 Canadian adults. We aimed for this sample to be approximately nationally representative with respect to age group, gender, and region, based on the distribution of those things in the 2021 census. With the exception that we specifically oversampled the Atlantic provinces relative to their population to give us a better sample size and allow us to draw some better conclusions in that region. We thought that was especially important after the 2023 fires affecting Nova Scotia. We really want to understand what's going on in this area where that's not necessarily as used to having these big wildfire impacts. The sample was mostly homeowners, as you can see in the lower left here. And then moving over, we didn't get quite as much rural representation as we'd hoped. We tried to get an oversample of people who indicated that they lived in rural areas or small cities and towns, just in hopes of capturing more people who were more likely to be at the wildland-urban interface. But the survey provider just wasn't able to reach quite enough people in those smaller communities on the timeline we needed. So that is a limitation of the data. And related to that, we asked everyone to indicate the risk of wildfire occurring in their local area to the best of their knowledge. And you can see here, around half indicated that there was low or no risk where they were, and only 14% said that risk was high or severe. So overall, this is a pretty low risk sample, at least based on these self-reports, which of course come with their own limitations. But we did get around 500 respondents in this high and severe risk group. And on the right here, you can just see the breakdown regionally of where these high and severe responses were most frequent. I will just note to take the number for the territories with a grain of salt there. Unfortunately, we had very few respondents in the territories. But otherwise, the responses were pretty much distributed as you would expect, with BC having the highest proportion of those high and severe responses, and lowest in Ontario, where we're capturing quite a few people in, the Toronto metro area where wildfire is not really a risk. So it's worth keeping this overall low risk profile in mind for context when interpreting the results. Most of the results I'll show will just be national level, but I will show a few breakdowns by region or by this self-reported risk metric to try to get us a little bit closer to understanding what some of our numbers might look like for people who are more likely to be in wildfire-prone areas specifically. So moving into some results here. We found almost half of the respondents in the sample said that they had been negatively affected by wildfire or knew someone who had. So looking at the light blue bars, which represent those personal experiences, you can see at the bottom that 20% said they had experienced at least one of these negative impacts as a result of wildfire or wildfire smoke. And twice as many, looking at the pink bars, said they knew someone who had been affected. The most commonly reported personal impacts were on mental health and physical health at 10 and 8% there. And 6% of people said that they had had to evacuate their home due to a wildfire. And almost a quarter of respondents said that they knew someone who had had to go through an evacuation. So although these experiences are relatively prevalent, most people said that they had not looked for recent information about wildfire risk in their area, what's being done about it, or how to reduce their personal risk. So looking at the top set of bars here, you can see only around a third of the overall sample had looked for this kind of information within the last 5 years. And then corresponding to the regional breakdown that I showed of self-reported risk and thinking on a very broad level corresponding to actual risk. Respondents in BC were the most likely to have looked for this information, and respondents in Ontario were least likely. And just another note here that will apply to all of the regional breakdowns I'll show, because the sample sizes in the territories were so small, as I mentioned, the numbers for these regions here, like BC and Yukon and Alberta and the Northwest Territories, those are effectively only representing the corresponding province. So this is just how we've approached things so far, rather than throw those data points out entirely. But I recognize it can be a little confusing, so just wanted to make that clear from the outset. So another kind of gap in awareness we saw was that a lot of respondents didn't know if their communities were planning or actively doing anything to address wildfire risk. So the yellow portions of these bars here represent those I don't know responses to this question. And if you look at the bottom half, so the people who reported living in a high or severe risk area, they were more likely to know these things and more likely to indicate that their communities were doing these things or taking some kind of action. So you can see 52% of people who said that they lived in a high or severe risk area indicated their communities were taking some kind of action to reduce wildfire risk. So around twice the percentage that we saw in the overall sample. But even among those respondents, we're still seeing quite a few who said they just don't know either way. We especially see that for FireSmart recognition, just at the very bottom, where around half of that higher risk subsample didn't know if their neighborhood or community had ever been recognized through that program. We also asked about awareness of FireSmart more broadly, and it was quite low, with 72% of this sample reporting no familiarity. Awareness of FireSmart did vary substantially by self-reported risk as you move down the slide here. You can see around half of the sample who said that their local risk was high or severe had at least some familiarity with FireSmart, compared to 20% or less when you get down into the people who said there was low or no risk. So it seems like word is getting out probably to the people that it most needs to get out to, in the areas that it most needs to get out to. But even in those higher risk groups, a lot of the familiarity we're seeing here is low to moderate familiarity. So in some cases, it could be as little as name recognition, rather than the really meaningful familiarity with FireSmart principles and how to apply them that we ultimately want to see. And then just looking at FireSmart awareness by region as well here, you can see respondents in BC were most likely to be familiar with FireSmart. In that case, 36% had at least some familiarity. And this result isn't shown in this graph, but I'll just make a note that awareness was especially high when we look at BC and Quebec respondents who perceived their local risk as high or severe. So when we get down into that subgroup, we're seeing numbers more like 60 to 70% who have at least some familiarity with FireSmart. So the picture is not as pessimistic as the overall national numbers suggest when you kind of get down into these higher risk groups, but it is important to still bear in mind that a lot of this is fairly low familiarity. just continuing this theme of some of the gaps in awareness and knowledge that are out there. Most Canadians didn't know that wildfire damage to homes and other buildings tends to occur as a result of embers. So only 29% got this right overall, if you look at the pie chart. And some of those respondents were in an experimental condition where we said this explicitly. We introduced the idea of embers causing this damage. And so the more representative number when we exclude that condition is this 25% in the top right here. So this isn't necessarily something that people need to know to, start taking action to reduce wildfire risk. But it seems plausible, for example, that if your idea of wildfire damage is really limited to, flames completely sweeping through an area and burning everything to the ground, the possibility you could take proactive steps to, reduce the risk of something happening to your home might not even be something that's on your radar. And this gap in awareness is also something that can potentially leave people vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation as well. I'm sure that this audience has probably seen examples of this, people claiming that increasing wildfire activity has nothing to do with the climate. It's all, deliberately set fires. And they'll sometimes show pictures of, burn patterns to try to support that assertion, saying things like, well, how could this have burned down when all of this around it wasn't touched, and that kind of thing. And that kind of argument might seem compelling to people who just aren't aware of how embers work. So we think this will be an important knowledge gap to address. And then looking at who people trust to provide good advice about how to protect their home and property from wildfires. Very good news for this audience. Local fire departments were most trusted by far here, with 83% trust, and much of that being strong trust. So to us, this really emphasizes the importance of other groups who want to increase awareness and engagement around wildfire risk reduction, really continuing to partner with and support existing efforts by fire departments in this area. So speaking from my position, comparatively, only 50% of people said that they trusted the federal government on this subject. Getting into some current engagement numbers, we found 60% of respondents had not taken any of these sort of miscellaneous actions we asked about related to understanding or communicating about local or property level risk and risk reduction. So the most prevalent actions here were talking to your neighbors about wildfire risk and getting familiar with local evacuation plans. Those were both at 21%. The latter being so low was especially concerning given, unlike some of the more wildfire specific things we asked about, getting familiar with local evacuation plans is ideally something everyone should be doing. It applies to a wide range of emergencies. So we were a little concerned about how low that was in the overall sample. And I will just note that, like FireSmart awareness, when you start breaking these things down by, self-reported risk or looking at higher risk regions, these results do start looking better in those cases. But even in those subgroups, we're still talking about a minority of people in those groups who have taken these actions. Getting into some of the residential FireSmart measures now. I won't spend a ton of time on all of these slides individually just because there were so many measures and behaviors in there, but happy to go back to anything at the end if there's a specific number that you really want to know. With respect to the structural home features, this slide is just showing how many people indicated their home had each of these features. So blue means yes, red means no, and yellow is indicating I don't know, with gray being this doesn't apply to my home. So the highest level of adoption we saw here was 56% for the multi-pane windows. Overall, adoption was pretty low across the board here. But one thing that really stood out was that a lot of respondents, and it's important to note here that we only asked homeowners this question about the home features. A lot of people were just unsure whether their homes had these features or not. So you can see those I don't know responses ranging from 17 to 39%. And we did describe these features in more detail than is shown here for the actual respondents in the survey. We had examples of fire-rated roof materials, for example. So this is another kind of awareness gap that we weren't necessarily expecting as much. That'll be important to keep in mind as efforts to increase engagement in some of these things continues to ramp up. As you would hope, adoption of these FireSmart home features did increase with perceived wildfire risk. So within each of the 6 graphs here, as you go from left to right, you're going from the low to no risk group up to the higher severe risk group. And you can see just visually this kind of increasing staircase effect across the board. So we are seeing significantly higher rates of adoption among people who indicate that risk in their area is higher severe. So this is a good sign, but you can see that the blue bars are still pretty low, even in that highest risk group in some cases. So even there, we're still seeing large gaps in adoption and still substantial uncertainty about whether homes have these features in some cases. I won't show this breakdown by risk for all of the residential FireSmart measures in this section, but I'll note that we saw this same general pattern for pretty much all of the yard and vegetation management type measures and the maintenance actions as well. So for these yard and vegetation management measures, overall uptake was also pretty low, but it was highest for pruning the low branches of trees. As some of the data later on will speak to more specifically, at least part of this is probably that, pruning is something people might do for aesthetic reasons or as part of general yard maintenance, regardless of whether you live in a high-risk area or are concerned about wildfire. Whereas something like maintaining a non-combustible zone around your home, that's going to tend to be more specific to wildfire risk. So not a super surprising pattern here. And then for these kinds of maintenance actions that need to be done on a recurring basis during the fire season, the first thing you can see easily here is that overall uptake was quite a bit higher for the most part. These are relatively lower cost, lower effort things that a lot of people are probably doing as part of regular maintenance, regardless of wildfire risk, similar to the pruning the low branches of trees. Storing combustibles far from the home being a kind of notable exception here. We saw relatively few people in this sample said that they are doing that. So getting into motivations and barriers for taking some of these actions. So for the measures that respondents said that they had already implemented or were planning to implement, we asked them what motivated that decision. So there's a lot going on these slides, and like with the previous section, I won't spend a lot of time on the subsequent ones that are focusing on the vegetation management and maintenance actions, but I've kept the color coding of the individual motivations here consistent, so you can at least pick out some of the trends across items more easily. So wildfire resistance as a motivation will always be shown in the deep orange red here. So on this slide, we have 4 of the home features where installation is really a pretty costly major project. And you can see that increasing property value represented in the lightest blue bars here. That was in the top 2 motivations for all of these. So that may be a promising kind of